Hey guys, welcome to Wood Magazine. Today we're going to be doing something a little different than normal. We have been shooting videos of projects or parts of projects, techniques, and little smaller run videos. This is going to be something kind of new for us. We're going to do a project build. I want to show you more of what we do and how we get to where we're getting, just to kind of augment some of the stuff in the story already, the photos and the illustrations and whatnot. So this project is something I'm pretty excited about. It's a mission settee modified by an LG Stickley design. So I hope you enjoy it and let us know what you think. We're going to start with the process of this settee build. I want to start with the end assemblies first. Basically the arm and the front and back legs and the two stretchers that go between them. It does have some slats on the side as you've seen in the plans. So the arm is a cold form lamination. And we've done this before in the past with another Morris chair build, so it's not new. One of the challenging aspects of this is that the arm is not just in an arc, but it actually goes up at a fairly straight and then makes a bend, a 4 or 5 degree bend at the top, where I'm going to try to wrap this laminations around a form that we're going to build here pretty quick too. So to do this, what I need to do is I need to get thinner stock. So what I've done is I've started with a piece of 8/4 sawn white oak, as thick as I can get it, because what I need out of that is 6 laminations at the end of it. A bandsaw doesn't take up a lot of material when you're cutting it. The curve's not that wide, but it's the thicker the stock, the better. I actually started with some stock that was almost 2 inches thick. So, because you need 6 laminations, and those 6 laminations are going to be approximately 3/16 of an inch when we're done. Basically what I'm doing is I'm joining one face, I'm resawing off, and then joining that face, resawing off, and so on and so forth till I get my 6 layers. And that's where I'm at right now. These are a little bit thicker than 3/16 of an inch, not quite a quarter, but close to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this down to the final thickness on my planer. To do that, I've made a sled. So basically I'm going to sit that lamination between these 2 little blocks and an end block, and then I'm going to run it through the planer. This will help kind of reinforce and support the bottom of that so the feed rollers don't push it down through the hole or the rollers in the bottom of the planer, causing snipe and possibly worse, destroying your pieces of wood. So this will help support the bottom of that while you're getting a good clean surface, and then we can machine that down, and that's what we're going to do now. We got all of our laminations planed down. Those are ready to go now. So what I got to do is the next step is I'm going to make a form. And I'm going to make my form out of MDF. MDF works great. Particle board, anything that's cheap, you know, but it's dense and hard. Plywood, you could do that. I think this gives you much flatter, smoother surface. That's why I prefer the MDF. So anyway, I got 7 layers of 3/4 inch MDF here. I've cut these to 5 by 30, which gives me plenty of room on the ends. I did cut my laminations long. I'm looking for an arm that's roughly 27 some inches long. So I cut these long so I can clean up the ends. Anytime you're doing a lamination stuff, give yourself some extra width and length, just because you're going to need that material to clean up those edges. I'm at about 5 3/8 roughly, and that's world, since my finished arm is going to be 5 inches. Next up, I'm going to make a sled basically for my table saw, because this arm has kind of a flat top and then tapers down. So I'm going to make a form to basically give me that shape. So I've laid out a couple lines here, one of about 7.5 inches from the end. That flat spot is about 7 inches. So that gives me some room to run extra material past that. I made a mark there, and then a mark down here according to my pattern. I just basically, using the grid, I laid out that line. I marked the line between those two, and then the other thing I'm going to do to make life easy for myself here, how I line this up with my taper jig, is I'm going to take those lines from the face and put them around towards the edge, because then I can take those lines and I can line them up, because I'm going to taper this piece off on my table saw, I'm just lining those lines up with the edge of my plywood. That way I know I've got the perfect position for my pieces, and I'll come in with some stops and I'll put those on and then we'll cut. I've got all the form parts cut. I'm going to now assemble these. And how I like to do that is I'm just going to glue these together and clamp them. But to kind of speed the process along, I will often use, this also helps dramatically reduce the parts shifting on you while you're trying to glue them together. MDF is notorious for being really smooth and really slick, so especially when you add glue to it. So the pin nail just kind of helps hold those guys in place. And you do have to move quickly depending on the glue you're using here. This stuff sets up pretty fast. Doing this form, there's other ways of doing that, I guess, is what my point was going to be. Is, you know, especially if you were dealing with a curved arm. In this case, it's straight, so this is pretty simple. The taper jig worked really good. But if my arm was curved, that wouldn't work so good. So what I would do is probably cut one of these pieces to precisely what the pattern indicates, and then cut the others within probably a 16th or an 1/8 inch or so of that line. And then I could pattern route the rest to fit that form perfectly. Just another way, you could do that on this too. It's a great way of making repetitive pieces so they match. In this situation, as long as my formed pieces are pretty darn close, that's what I'm looking for. You're dealing with some pretty large, thick laminations, so they're not really going to follow the contour of individual pieces if they're off, say, a 64th of an inch. There's just not enough. If it was veneer, they were thin, and you had a vacuum bag, it probably would. But in this case, this will work perfectly. So I'm all together, and then I'm just going to start adding some clamps to really cinch that up. I'll let that sit for a bit so that's nice and dry. You kind of imagine trying to glue this many layers together that you're probably going to fight it pretty hard of trying to keep them from slipping and sliding apart. But you can see I've got a pretty good fit there, or pretty good flush on all edges, just how I want it. So I'm going to let that set up, let that dry. And the other thing I'm going to do to finish this form off is I'm going to add some cleats to the underside of this. And then I'm also going to have a plating that I'm going to put over the laminations that'll help me apply even pressure and kind of help keep my clamp population to a minimum. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a plate that goes across. I'm probably going to kerf it, and you'll see that when we do our lamination next. But that plate will help keep everything even pressure when I'm clamping. Welcome back. I've got the form done. I got it cleaned up, so I'm ready to get my arm laminations glued up and on the form. I did also cut a caul where I've made a few curves in the caul right where that joint's going to be. That way this thing can kind of bend around that. You just want to make sure you don't go too far and to weaken that joint where it just blows apart. So anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue this up first. I'm using a cold press veneer adhesive. This stuff is slow setting, and that's the reason I'm using it. The other option for this type of work, I would use Type Bond 3, just because of the slow set time. So I'm applying a nice layer, even layer, all the way to the edges. Make sure you have plenty of glue there. Honestly, if you have some fine cracks that you couldn't get this pinched down quite so well. The glue can kind of act as a little bit of a filler. This glue is toned, has a wood tone to it, kind of a dark brown or light brown tone, matches the wood. You can see I'm just working along here. This roller is just a hard, pretty firm foam roller. You can get these at veneer supply places too. Same place with the glue. You know, you want to move at a nice quick pace, just because you want to have plenty of time. You're going to have several clamps, as you can kind of see, that we're going to have to get into position, and we want to be able to have plenty of time for that. So some people, if you get a lot, if you feel like you're going to be super messy with this, I do sometimes put packing tape on the form. This situation, my form's it's the same width really as my laminations. I'm not too concerned about it. But so what I'm doing is I want to make sure this end, I have actually drawn a line on the other side, not your side, but I've drawn a line here which indicates this is the distance between here and here that I need to have finished. So I'm gonna extend this lamination out past that line. It's still on the form. And then I'm going to place my caul on top of this. And the key here is I want that bend to kind of center on that the area right here where that I marked the line. That's the 7 inches where that starts to angle off. That's where you want that plywood caul to be able to bend. And then basically it's kind of a start at one end or the other. I prefer to use the big heavy duty clamps on this end, because most of your clamping pressure is going to be right here in this zone. This is where all the action is going to happen. By the time you get out towards the end of the arm, you're really not, your clamping force, you have leverage, I guess is what I'm trying to say. This first one's really the trickiest one. Once you get going, as you start moving down, it gets easier. You're just making sure that everything's staying as aligned as it possibly can. You're on the form. Your caul hasn't shifted out of position. And you want to make sure, like I said, you make sure you have plenty of meat past that line, because that's where you're going to cut off the front of the arm. And this, you want to make sure you get clamping pressure as close to that line. We're going to split it. We're going to one on one side, one on the other, because that's really where those veneers are going to want to open up. You can kind of watch this kind of come right around that corner. If you don't have enough thread in your clamp, other ways we can kind of encourage this to go down a little bit with a temporary clamp down here, kind of get it going in the right direction. So you can really see how those are closing up. I'm getting squeeze out there. It's telling me my joints are getting nice and tight. I'm putting these clamps about every 2 or 3 inches. These really work well. Any F-style clamp is going to work well. The key is that you have to provide a lot of torque, and I don't know that the quick grip style clamps will work perfectly for this, but the F-style clamps definitely do. It's looking really good. So at this point, I'm going to let this sit. I'm going to let it sit overnight, at least for a good 12 hours before I come back and take these clamps off. The beauty with the cold form laminations like this, you shouldn't have any spring back whatsoever. So this, if it is, it's negligible. So anyway, we'll let this sit overnight and then we'll repeat for the other side. We're going to start working on the front legs of the settee. I've got 4 blanks that I've roughed out for the 2 front legs. These are going to be 2 1/4 by 2 1/4 square. I'm going to bevel rip these pieces and create a leg like this. I will fill this with a core piece so it'll be solid. But the reason I'm doing that is I want quarter sawn on all 4 sides of this piece. And to do that, I'm just going to basically do bevel rips. We could certainly create a 2 1/4 square leg by gluing up this way. You just end up, this leg, you're going to see it on all 3 sides predominantly. And it'd be nice to have that quarter sawn on all 4. So I've set up my blade in the saw. I've tilted to 45. A couple little things on 45. I do like to use my combination square to make sure that that's dialed in. Is I like to cut a piece of scrap material. MDF works great. What I do is I rip a strip, rip the 45, flip it around, rip the other side, and then I just cut it into small chunks. And then I can wrap it, put it together, and then I can check and see how well I did. So this is an inexpensive way of kind of checking your setup before you get into cutting. I'm going to bevel rip one side and then come back into the other side. One thing I like to point out on this, just a safety deal, once you get to that second side, make sure you use a push stick, but do not use that push stick. You want to stay in the center of that so that thing does not flip up on you, creating a little hazard. So keep that in mind when you're using your push stick. Stay in the center of the board. We've got our legs bevel ripped. Now what we want to do, put these together. So when I'm doing this, I don't just grab 4 pieces randomly. I'm visualizing this as going to be, this will be, say, the left leg. What I'm doing is I'm going to put my best grain forward, and then the sides of that front leg, I'm going to put really nice grain on that too. And then the back of the leg, of course, you don't really ever see. I do have some flecking in that, but I'm going to pick the best foot forward. So at this point, I'm actually picking a left leg and a right leg, and I'm selecting that grain so it kind of matches the look that I want. I've got these guys kind of organized here, and I'm lining them up. What I'm going to do, you've seen this trick before in the magazine, but I am basically going to tape these guys together like we've seen us do picture frames. I'm making sure the tips of my bevel rip miters there are all nice and stuck together, and I'm putting just some blue painter's tape down on this. Okay, and then you carefully, we're going to flip this over, and then we're going to kind of roll this up. Now this is kind of what I do as far as a test fit, making sure that I've got everything ready to go before I throw all the glue on there. And I'm going to lock up this one end here, getting it as snug as I can with the tape. And then I'm going to I want to fit my core in there. I want to make sure that I've got a good fit. It slides in. It actually should slide in. There shouldn't be any big gaps there. So I'm going to put that in there. And then I'm going to clamp this up. This is still dry. I'm going to clamp it up both directions. And because these are, and once you add glue to these, keep in mind these are going to want to move around on you. So when you're clamping these bevels, the tape will help hold them in place. But when you're clamping, and I like to apply pressure equally to both clamps, so you're pushing in both sides at the same time, gives you the best fit. So I've got a nice snug fit there. I've left room for glue, and the guy is ready to add glue now. You know, glue selection here, I'm going to move fairly quickly. I'm not too concerned about the setting up on me too fast. So I'm just going to use some regular yellow carpenter's glue. And it's kind of like the picture frame sort of thing, is you only have to apply glue to one side of the bevel. And then we're going to have to come back in and also nice dab of glue right down the center where our core piece will be. So you can go ahead and lay that core in there if you want to as you wrap this around. Use our tape to kind of hold that in position. And this is another one of those projects or glue ups, it does require a handful of clamps. So be prepared for that. Make sure that you're clamping in both directions to really close up the tips of those miters. You kind of see how a little bit of that glue's squeezing out all the way around that. That's what we want, okay? And then we're just going to kind of work our way down this. And there you go. Nice tight miters. My edges looks like they've all kind of closed up really well. You're going to have some breakage with the white oak, especially quartersawn white oak. The edges tend to be a little fragile, and sometimes you'll get a little breakage here or there, but we're going to softly round that edge and we can kind of disguise any of that imperfections whatsoever. But anyway, I'll let this set for an hour or so, and then we'll turn around and do the other leg. All right, guys, so we've got the front legs knocked out, and it's time to move on to the back legs of our side assembly. Because of the shape of the legs, because it actually has a couple angles in it, we cannot assemble it the same way that we did the front legs, where we have quartersawn grain on all four sides. So what we're going to do is we're going to end up gluing up 3 layers of 3/4 inch material to get to our 2 1/4 inch thick leg. We're going to have to start with a little bit wider material because our leg is a little bit wider. I've gone off our gridded patterns in the magazine. Basically, I've taken those and then laid out on a piece of scrap that leg shape. Now we got our leg template shaped. I rough shaped on the bandsaw. I did try to stay outside the line a little bit, so we're going to come over here to the bench, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my time cleaning up these edges. Obviously the inside ones are a little bit more of a challenge. You know, a hand plane doesn't really reach those too well, or a large portion of it. So I may end up going to the drum sander, doing a little sanding or that. Lots of ways of shaping that, but just take your time. We're trying to create a really good template to use for your legs. One thing when you're hand planing too, on these angled cuts, you want to make sure you go downhill. So basically if the grain is flowing out or coming out of that angled cut I made, it's coming out that way, you want to make sure you plane downhill to that, as opposed to trying to plane back this direction, because you'll tear all that out. So on these inside, you might be able to sneak in there a little bit with the smaller hand plane and get pretty close to those those corners. Spoke shave, another really good tool to do this type of work too. There, I've got that shaped pretty well. My leg's about 37 inches, and this board, I'm about 68, 69 inches. So what I'm doing is I'm going to lay this on here. I'm lining up my bottom and this front face, because I know those are good points to register from. I'm now going to trace this pattern onto my stock that I prepared. This has been milled down to close to 3/4 of an inch. So I've laid that on there. Now what I'm going to do is then I'm going to come down here and I can nest that leg right up in here. I'm leaving basically about a quarter, maybe a little more than a 1/4 inch away from the front of this leg and the front of that leg. So now I'm going to trace this on. Anyway, I'm going to take these now, glue 3 of these together. I'm going to go to the bandsaw. We'll rough cut them. I am going to stay outside the lines, probably a little bit strong 16th. Okay guys, so I glued up my 3 blanks to create my back leg, or the 3 pieces of 3/4 stock to create my 2 1/4 inch blank. And I have cut out the front edge of that. Of course, machining the outer side is a lot easier. I was able to use my joiner and actually clean this up, get it to the line, And I probably could do that on this edge too, but I could probably just use my hand plane. So I'm gonna go to the bandsaw, and we're gonna cut this back side. And what you're trying to do is you want to stay as close to that line as possible while you're machining that. The blank is really too tall for most flush trim bits, otherwise I could use my pattern to kind of flush trim this. This is really tall. If you have access to that, it can work. You could certainly use your drum sander or sander for that fact. Just be careful and get as close to the line as possible. So we're going to cut this leg out and then go from there. Okay, now that I got the back to shape roughly, we're going to go back to use the same method as we did before on the combination of tools. And of course, good old sandpaper and a block of wood, and this works really good to getting all those bandsaw marks out and any of the undulations and kind of fine tuning it basically. So after we've got our legs kind of shaped the way we want them, the next process is I'm going to start with the mortises. Once I start doing mortising on these legs, I will have a right and a left. So they'll be mirror images of each other. A lot of times I'll mark those on the bottom of the leg, which one's which, so I kind of keep track of them. So just keep that in mind when you start to machine, that not everything's going to be machined from the same side, okay? So just keep track of that. So I'm going to secure this in my vise here. Since my laminations are all 3/4 of an inch, that 3/4 of an inch in is where we're going from the outside face. This is going to be my outside face. So I'm going in 3/4 of an inch, and then I'm going to route a 3/8 inch mortise with a spiral bit. There are other ways of doing this. Obviously, we could set this in the drill press and then keep the offcut that we had from underneath here to help support the workpiece. We could drill a series of holes and then chisel it. This would be too tall for my mortiser. Basically, you're somewhat limited, either hand cutting them or a router. Obviously, this is what we chose, was a router. I'm going to use a spiral bit, and I'm using a fence. And I'm just going to make several passes. You'll see it'll take me a few passes to get this thing whittled down. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to set the parameters on this for my fence. It's stop block. So basically, I don't have to kind of pay attention to that line the entire time I'm routing. I can really concentrate on keeping my fence tight against my workpiece. A lot of times when you come to the end of the mortise, when we're going to make multiple passes and go down a little at a time, when you get to the end of the mortise, the router could have a tendency to bite because it's going to try to take more material. With the stop blocks, basically you're going to stop that bit and it's not going to keep going on, so you don't get that big bite once you get the bit down deep in the mortise, okay? So when I'm doing this, one thing to be note of, I do get a little further up. I get onto that top part of that leg, and this can tilt, so keep pressure against the fence and make sure you keep downforce on the router. Now I'm set up to go. I got my stop blocks in position to stop my router fence, so I know the parameters of my mortise. The other thing I just need to concentrate on, again, is keeping this, make sure this fence of the router is tight against that face. All right, so we can see we took our time, and now I've got a perfect mortise. It does have rounded corners. The plans call for a rectangular tenon. You can come in here obviously with a chisel and chisel that out. The other option is to leave that and just round over the ends of your tenon. I'm going to keep setting up here and do the rest of my mortises and move on to cutting our rails and forming tenons next. Hey guys, welcome back to the wood shop. This morning I was going to finish doing mortises. We got the back legs done yesterday, and this morning I want to do the front legs. Because the material is a little more manageable in size, specifically the width or thickness, I could do this on my hollow chisel mortiser. However, since I'm already set up with the router and the spiral bit and the fence, I'm just going to continue on with that operation. I've laid out my mortises where they need to be per the plans. One thing I wanted to mention on this one too is that we do have a mortise at the top of each leg that actually cuts through the top of the leg, so it terminates outside as opposed to being a closed mortise. So I'm actually going to use the other leg, and I'm going to put them end to end and then clamp these together so they're flush, and then secure this assembly, these two legs, to my bench, and then I can route both those mortises in the tops of the legs at the same time. Like on the back legs, I'm going to do the same thing with these stop blocks. You'll see me, I'm going to set these in here, and that helps, again, define the outer edges of my mortises. I'm back, and we've moved on to the rails. So I've machined all the rails, including the ones that connect the two side assemblies, because what we're going to be doing some similar operations here, and instead of setting up twice, we're going to get it all done at one time. So what I'm set up to do right now is I'm going to mill a 3/8 by 3/8 inch groove on one edge of all my rail stock. And this is basically where I'm gonna drop in my slats, the big wide slats, and the spacers that go between them. So I'm set up with a 3/8 inch dado set, and I have got that set to 3/8 inch high, and I'm 3/16 away from the fence. Most of the stock, except for the bottom side rails, is 3/4 stock. This is 8/4. It's actually machined to 1.5 inch, and the question may arise: why are we using something different here? And it'll be a lot easier to explain later on once we get the side assemblies put together and along with the front and back rails. So I'm going to machine these grooves and then machine some strips so we can start putting fillers in there, and I'll show you how I'm going to create the mortises for the side slats and the back slats. Okay guys, I've machined up some stock for my fillers, and I've machined it to fit the groove side to side snug, and then I've left it in the other direction. I've left it just a little proud so I can come back and clean all these up. I wanted to make sure I didn't leave it too low, so I left it, I'm not even talking a 64th of an inch, but the thing I wanted to point out is my planer has a tendency to snipe, as a lot of planers do. So when you're checking your fit, don't just check your fit at the end, because I'm going to get rid of this end piece anyway because it's too loose. The best thing to do is go into where your planer doesn't snipe, you know how far it is, usually it's just an inch or so, and make sure that that fits tight in that groove. So I'm going to waste that first piece, and then I've set up a stop block, and I've got a list of how many of these little guys I need. I need 4 lengths of fillers. So I've set up my stop block so I can just slide over and cut off what I need. And once I get the number I need of this length, I'll change, and we'll just continue to make all the fillers we need. Okay, so that should be all the spacers we need for the side rails and the 2 back rails, the upper and lower back rails. So I've plenty of stock left over. If I find some in here that don't look very nice, I can go ahead and cut a couple more for myself. So I'm going to get these we'll get these glued in place, and we'll show you how I do that. We've got our grooves cut in our rails, and I've got my filler material machined. And now it's time to fill these grooves up and create the mortises for our slats in the sides and in the back. This is my top side rail. This is my side bottom rail. And you'll notice there's a difference in the length. This is a measurement that it's 22.5 inches is the length of this part. Now you'd think the top rail would be 2. However, we have to accommodate, as this goes into the mortise there, you can see the top rail is going to come in and hit this at an angle. And we haven't machined our mortise for this yet, because what I want to do is I'm going to machine the mortise on the front of this first, and then once I have this in the leg, I can do a little bit of fine tuning to know where all this is supposed to end up. I would leave these a little bit long, and that way it gives you the ability to fit this into the back leg. That's why they're different lengths, but I also wanted to point that out. So when you were filling the fillers, that you would realize that once you got on this other top side rail, that you'll have a gap here. This will somewhat terminate pretty close to where this is. It's intended to be inside this filler. So start from one end, work to the other end. Don't start on the ends and move to the center, because it won't work out for this guy here. So how I do this, I've cut this material so it is pretty snug in one direction inside the groove. I have left it a slight bit proud, so I can come back and clean that up later. I wasn't concerned about that. But you want to make sure this fits in there snugly, but not so tight that it's causing this groove to wedge apart. I mean, this 3/16 of material with white oak's pretty firm, but you know, jamming a piece of wood in there that's too tight will definitely spring that apart. And then you'll end up with gaps on top of your rail there between the filler and the cheeks of that groove. So what I'm going to do, basically, if I don't have to fine tune with a planer or sandpaper, I'm just going to add a little bit of glue along the bottom of this thing. You can put a little bit on the side walls, but quite honestly, it's probably going to end up in the bottom anyway. You don't need a lot of glue, and you don't want to have to deal with a lot of squeeze out at the end. So press it down in there, and what I like to do is basically kind of tap on the end here until it's perfectly flush. Got that one in. The next one I think is the 1.25 inch. We'll drop this in. Quarter. So I'm going to line up with my 5.25 mark there and press that into place. Okay, so I'm basically going to repeat this process for this other side rail. This will, however, end up in the middle because it's centered on this. Referencing from the front leg back, the slats should line up where I want them to go. The back rails, same operation. You'll have a longer spacer at the end of each, the top back rail and the bottom back rail, and then the mid spacers are all going to be evenly spaced. Same procedure, and then we'll go to cutting some tenons on the ends of these guys. Today we are going to be doing some tenon work. I want to machine tenons on the ends of all my rails. You know, once I'm set up, I can pretty much do it all, not just the side assemblies. That's what we've been working on primarily. But I can do the tenons on the rails that connect the two side assemblies since I'm going to be already set up. So I've got those rails back here too. We'll cut tenons on those. So I'm going to form tenons on the 3/4 stuff first and then switch to the thicker stuff. And then I want to show the tenons for the back of the top side rails are angles. So we're going to have a slightly different setup for that, and it's going to be a little bit trickier, but I wanted to show you that, and I also wanted to show you how I like to approach those as opposed to just going off the drawing and this is what it's going to be. I like to dry fit these things and really fine tune the positioning and length and all that for those mortises when they're a little trickiness to them. So I have set up 3/16 inch height. I'm going to start by making some test cuts, and then I'll probably just sneak up on the final height, and then we'll go from there. All right, guys, so we've got all of our tenons cut, and except for the lower side rails and our angled tenon. I wanted to point out on the top side rail that we're not cutting that tenon all the way around. The top has to sit flush with the top of the leg. So make sure you don't cut your top of the tenon there against the shoulder. So the rest of them, we're going to cut those basically all the way around, all four sides. The lower side rail, we're going to cut the tenon on that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the this face, the 3/16 face, towards the outside, which is this is the outside, which will be seen. So we're going to make that cut, and same setup, and then we're going to raise our blade up until we get that tenon to fit nicely into our leg. So I'm going to work those down, get those fine-tuned, and then I have decided on this particular build, I'm going to just round the ends of these tenons as opposed to going through the work of squaring the mortises and the legs. But I think in the end I'll have a really strong joint. So that's what we're going to work on right now. We've got our first assembly. We're starting to drive fit, and basically what I've been doing is rounding over my tenons, like I said I was going to do on the ends that are going in the mortises to match the radius in the mortises. And what I'm using is just basically a little file. I can take plenty of material away quickly, easily controlled, and all I'm doing is just kind of trying to round that over enough to where it's going to fit into that space snugly. If you have to, you might use a little chisel to chamfer those edges, but this, as you can see, works pretty fast. So what I'm trying to do is basically do that, all right? You get there pretty quick. The other thing too, when I'm fitting these tenons, as I said, I like to leave these a little bit snug. So what I've been doing is using my rabbiting plane, like I said. And I'm just taking off a little material at a time. It's a lot easier to come back and take a little bit more than it is to have to glue some sacrificial pieces back on and start over. So just take your time as you're trying to fit those in there. So it starts to slide in like that. And that's what we're kind of going for with a fit. Is you want it to go in and you want it to be able to hold itself there. So now we need to fit our top side rail. We need to cut the tenon on the back of this, that angled tenon we've talked about. I've got my tenon done on the front of my side rail, so now we need to do the back. I like to do this by fitting this piece to this assembly. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to place that side rail on the outside of that front leg, and I want to hold that so that tenon shoulder is tight to the front leg and flush at the top, okay? And I'm just going to clamp that in place there. I'm holding on to it because I don't want it to move on me. Making sure that's tight, I'm going to come and then clamp the back side of this. So now I have a point where I can mark a reference line where this is tight up here. I now know where I need to mark to make this shoulder of the tenon tight to the back leg. So what I'm doing is I'm using a marking knife that's going to be a little more accurate than a pencil. And that's it. So, and in the plans we have this, it's a 9-degree angle. And the reason I say go ahead and mark it is that, you know, if you're off a little bit with this, 8.5 or whatever it is, this is a sure way of fitting it to this assembly. Even both of them might be a little bit different, okay? So it's just one of those subtleties that this is a way for you to really fine tune that joint. All right, so I've marked it. The next thing I need to do basically is I need to make sure what this angle is. And what I'm using basically is a kind of adjustable angle finder. And I'm putting it on the workpiece. I'm lining it up with that line, and then I'm adjusting it to find out what my actual angle is. And in this case, I was really close to 9 degrees. So I feel comfortable that I can set my miter gauge now to this 9 degrees and have it cut a good fitting joint. So I've got my first mark. I want to actually take that mark and then transfer it around to the edges of this piece, because that's what I'm going to be referencing, and I can see those and line them up with my blade. So I'm going to mark the top and bottom of this, and that gives me a good point to go from. You're going to have to set your miter gauge to, in this case, 9 degrees in one direction and 9 degrees in the other direction. Depends on how you're going to do that, which one first, but you're going to have to adjust your miter gauge to cut both sides. And then what I like to do is I like to come in and bring my blade right up to that line, okay? So then I know that's where I need to be. Okay, I'm going to 9 degrees in the opposite direction. I want to line it up with my mark. Okay, so now we have the cheeks, outside, inside face of the tenon cut, and now I'm going to cut the top and bottom of this. You could do this on the table saw by staying this vertical and tilting your blade. However, I find this just as easy to cut this by hand, and that's what I'm going to do with this. So I'm going to lay out the width of my tenon, and then I'm going to go to the bench and cut and do a little chisel work, and we'll get that cut. I'm laying out the rest of this piece. We have an angle that goes down and starts in from about what is 4.5 inches in from the end of the tenon. So I've made a mark, and then at this point it's 1 inch down, and I've made a mark. I've made that line. This identifies the top of the piece, and then I've also laid out where the tenon is going to be. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bandsaw and remove this material, get that cleaned up, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to handsaw and chisel and form the rest of that tenon. So I stayed right outside the line, and now I'm just going to do a few passes with the hand plane and true up this edge, get it nice and smooth. Next up, I'm going to cut these tenons. So what I'm doing is I'm just using the already established shoulders on the sides as a reference point for me to lay my chisel down on that, and then I'm just turning my chisel into that remaining material. It comes right out. It keeps everything nice and flush. My tenon is formed, and I've clamped the front end of that just like I did to mark the shoulder location. I've got it flush at the top and flush against that front leg. And now what I'm going to do is, this is how I locate exactly where that tenon is going to be, is I can come in now and mark that tenon. Okay, now I know exactly where that needs to go. I can just transfer those lines around to the front face, and I've got my tenon location. So what I've done, guys, is I've taken my lines on the side of the leg where I'd marked the tenon location, and I've transferred those around to the inside face. And just like we did before with the other mortises, I set up some stop blocks so I don't go past those, and that determines the length of my mortise. And I've basically set the fence so it is the same distance from the edge to the inside of that mortise as well. Okay, after you've formed the tenons on your rails, and particularly the bottom rails, the two front and back that connect the two side assemblies, the two wider rails, and then the two wide rails on the bottom of the side assemblies, these guys here, when they go into the leg, they will intersect each other. So you will need to chamfer the inside edges of those four pieces. So, and a quick and easy way of doing this is just taking a hand plane, sharp blade. You're just creating about an 1/8 inch chamfer, and that's about all you're going to need for those two when they do intersect each other in that leg. That way the tenon can seat into that mortise. So you just have to do these on the four lower stretchers, the two on the ends and two front and back. Now that we have our parts machined, I fit my tenon on my back leg, that angled tenon we were just finishing up, and I cut a couple of slats. These are the wide slats that go into the sides, and I've sanded everything on the inside faces that I can't really get to very easily after the fact, and we are ready to glue this up. One thing with these slats, I want them to be able to move. That's why I have the kind of the notches on the ends so they can expand and contract, but I don't necessarily want them rattling around in there, so I'm going to put just a little dab of glue in the center of each of these mortises that will hold those in the middle. And now we can go to applying glue to our tenons. And I'm just using yellow wood glue. I don't need a lot of working time, I don't believe, with this, so I'm going to move fairly quickly. Obviously, if you like to work at a slower pace, Titebond 3 is a good choice. It dries slowly, so you can take plenty of time that way. My mortises are snug, and I don't have to really, I'm not applying a whole bunch of glue on here. I want enough to hold that joint secure, but I also don't want to have to come back and clean up a whole bunch of squeeze out and make a big mess. So the thing you got to make sure is that it's flush at the top before we clamp this. I like to go back and clean up any squeeze out that I may have had at this time instead of trying to scrape off later, and then we'll let this set up for a couple hours, and we'll do the other side, and then we'll be ready to assemble the two side assemblies with our longer stretchers and our back. So I've got my back top rail, and I need to cut the arch on the top of that. We've done fairing strips in the magazine many times before. There's downloadable plans. But for something longer like this, I just wanted to show you a quick little easy way of making a nice fair curve. And basically what I've done is I've ripped a plywood strip 3/16 of an inch wide. You want it to be fairly flexible, but you also don't want it so thin that it can't hold an arc. And when you're pressing your pencil against it, it moves too much. So you want a little rigidity in it, so 3/16 to 1/4 inch is about right. I've marked a center line in the middle of the board that it indicates how far down that arc comes from the top edge. So I'm going to try to hit that point, and then of course the 2 points on the end. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to clamp this strip to the ends, and I'm going to create a little bit of a bow in the middle of it while I'm doing that. And then I can kind of adjust this a little bit to meet my center point. And then from that point, I'm kind of looking it over, making sure it actually looks like it's curving, and then I'm just going to come in mark my curve. Way to clean up a bandsaw curve this big. Spoke shave works really well. It takes a little time to take out the bumps, but I've also found that, you know, a little block plane skewed a little bit to one side does a pretty good job of removing a pretty good chunk of material too. Just have to be careful. Normally when you're going downhill or down that curve, you're going to have best success of not tearing out material. And then kind of once you get to the bottom of that, if I've got this side kind of cleaned up, what I'll do is just, I'll turn this around and then work back in the other direction. And obviously with the spoke shave, what's nice is you can kind of work it. You know, it's a tool that you can work towards you, but you know, also obviously you can push it away. Some prefer to do this only to push it away from them. Now we're ready to assemble the back. We're getting closer to the final assembly of the bench, but the back I would want to assemble this first because one, it's got so many parts in it. When we do our final assembly, we want to have as few parts to have to mess with as possible because it's big and it's cumbersome. So what I'm going to do is I've laid everything out and I've dry fit everything, fits together nicely. I'm going to do this same way that I did the side assemblies, where I'm going to add a dot of glue in each one of these mortises in the middle of it, and not too much, just enough to keep these things from rattling. So I'm going to do that on the top and the bottom rail. And then I'm going to fit slats into their spots on the top rail. I'll lay this down. If you notice, I've got this laying on a strip of plywood that I cut. It actually is the same piece of plywood that I cut to mark my curve. It's 3/16 of an inch thick, which happens to be the same distance from the face of these pieces to the mortise. So basically what I've done is I've propped them up so when I lay this down, I'm going to have a much easier time of feeding those into those mortises there. So I'm just going to start at one end, and I'm going to work my way down the other end, sliding these guys into place. Once I get everybody in position, I'm going to clamp that in place. And now I'm ready to go to my final assembly. We have our side assemblies glued up now. And I have added a couple pieces. I put the corbels on the front legs, and then I went ahead and fit this one arm. I also added the faux through tenon to the top of that. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to demonstrate how I fit that arm, how I got that on there, and I'm also going to kind of go through making that faux tenon and how to put that into the top of the arm. So what I've done is I've added a block back here for extra support. So I wanted you to see that before I turn this around. So I have trimmed the front edge of my arm. I've got that all flush. So what we're going to do is going to lay it on that support block, and that corbel in the front I'm going to measure 1.5 inches, which is the overhang that I want. I'm going to hold this in place, and I'm just going to use my marking knife to mark the back of that so I know exactly where to make my cut to fit around that arm. I'm also going to mark the back edge of this because I'm going to get rid of a few little excess here, and you'll see why in a minute. But I'm going to take this to the table saw, and we're going to make our first cut on that arm. So as before, it's a good idea to have an adjustable angle finder. That way you can find out what exactly that angle is. You know, the drawings, it's supposed to be 6 degrees, and it may or may not be that, but this is a good way to find that. I'm going to tilt my miter gauge to 6 degrees. You want to make sure you're going in the right direction. I've marked another line here is the depth, which is, I want to go 2.5 inches in that. That's as high as I can go. Now, not every table saw blade is going to be able to go to that height. That's fine. We'll probably have to make the final cut or finish that off with a handsaw. And if you have an alternate tooth blade you're using, it's probably a good idea to not go the full height and just leave that corner, and you can come back and use a chisel to really kind of fine tune and clean that up. Okay, so I've got my cut that's going to hit the front edge of the leg, and now I need to remove that material. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to stand it vertical and do that. But I need to get my miter gauge back to 0. Make sure we're at 2.5 inches. And I'm going to take a measurement here to see how far up into this I have to be. It looks like about 2 3/8. So I'm going to actually lower my blade a little bit. Okay. So if you feel comfortable doing this, just use your miter gauge like this. You know, obviously, if you wanted to, you could add an auxiliary fence that's just a bit higher. For safety's sake, I like to clamp the workpiece in position, and then I kind of keep my hands at a safe distance. Okay, so now I've removed that piece of material, and you can kind of see down in here there's a little bit of stuff, but I can easily chisel that out and clean that up. So the other thing is now I lost my mark on my back side, but I can reposition that up there and mark that against my back leg, and then I will probably mark a mark in here and then do the same thing. I'm going to tilt my miter gauge back to the 6 degrees and finish cutting that flush. Before we can fasten our arm to our side assembly, we need to make the cutout for the false through tenon. And what I've done is I just made a little jig here. So I'm gonna use a router bit. I'm actually gonna use a kind of a dado clean out bit. It's got a bearing on it. And I'm gonna plunge it down in here and just clean out majority material, and then we'll chisel the corners. But basically it's a 2x2 square. I've added a cleat to one side. It's about 3/8 of an inch away from that, which is how far in on the inside edge of the leg where that's going. So, and then I've made a mark 1 5/8 from the end, and I'm going to just clamp this in place so it doesn't move around on me. And since I'm going to plunge this down in there, I'm just going to rotate the router down in there, and then we'll just kind of clean this out slowly. And it's a pretty big bite, but we're taking about 1/4 of an inch. But just take your time and it'll do just fine. Okay, without moving my jig, is I'm going to use the sidewall of that jig to clean up my corners. I'm going to use the back edge of that chisel right against that, and then I can kind of just drive down into those corners. Nice square corners. And we're just going to clean up, make sure we get everything out of the bottom of that little mortise. And we'll get it all ready for our fake tenon. So we have our mortise on our arm all complete. Now we need to form our faux tenon. How I'm going to do that is I've basically got a piece of 2x2 stock here. If you don't have 2x2 stock, then you're just going to have to laminate it. That's fine. But you need 2x2. And a little trick, whenever I'm actually cutting this jig, this is a 5-part jig, but what I've done is I ripped 2-inch strips. Then I cut one strip so that I have my 2-inch hole and then glued it back together. But I also cut my stock at the exact same time, so I knew that this would be a really tight fit. So if you do that all at one time without moving your saw fence, then you'll know this is going to match your jig. So that's what I've got here, 2-inch by 2-inch. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to chamfer this edge. I'm just going to put a little chamfer on the top edge of this. And then I'm going to go to my saw and I'm going to cut this off. So I've got a 1/4 inch deep mortise, and I want this 3/8 of an inch thick. Little mark here. I'm going to go to the saw, I'm going to cut this off, and we'll show you how I fit that. Okay, so I have my faux tenon. Probably going to have to do a little sanding, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to chamfer ever so slightly the bottom edge of this. I don't want to jam it down in there because I still have to drill a hole here and actually drive a screw into the top of the leg whenever I do glue this down. But right now I'm just trying to get a good idea of a good fit. So basically what I'm going to do is if I know I can get it started, then I know we'll be just fine. So I'm just ever so slightly sanding those edges a little bit. Okay, once I feel like I can get that started, I'm going to stop there and I'm going to finish sanding my arm. I'm going to finish sanding all the faces of my side assembly on the legs that I can't get to after I glue this on. And then we're going to drive a screw, we'll glue this in place on the side assembly. And then after that's set up, we'll come back and glue that guy in. Okay, at this point, I've finished sanding the arm, and I also trimmed the back so it is flush with the back edge of the leg, the back leg. And I've placed it on here. It sits on here. I'm checking to see how it follows the top of the top rail of the side assembly, and it's fitting pretty good. If you have to, there might be a little fine tuning necessary with a block plane or some sanding. But once you're happy with where you are, we're going to glue this in place. And then after the glue is dried, we're going to go ahead and I'll add a screw down through the middle of the mortise. So the back goes flush and tight against the back leg. We want to make sure that that has equal overhang. And what I'm doing is I'm just going to, I've used a longer clamp, and I'm just going to go underneath the bench. I would let this dry for several hours just to make sure. You may have flexed that arm a little bit. You want that glue to have ample time to set up. So if you did this at the last thing of the day, let that sit overnight and you'll be ready to go the next morning. Okay, so we have got some open floor space. Because of the length of this bench, we need plenty of room to assemble it. And assembling on your workbench could be a little too tall. So what I've done is I've got a couple blocks on the floor that are risers. I've got the one assembly laying on that face up. And then I'm just going to start adding glue to my rails and inserting those into those tenons. And then we're going to grab our other side, fit it over the top, and get this thing clamped up. And you'll want to move quickly with this because obviously glue will start to set up on you. You don't want that. I'm using Titebond 1 because I think I can get through this pretty quick. If you need more time, obviously go ahead and grab the Titebond 3 because it's going to give you more setup time. As always, anytime you're doing a glue up this big, at any size, it's always a good idea to do a dry run first. Make sure all your clamps are adjusted to the length it should be, and you know where everything is. Okay, at this point, I'm going to tilt it up because I only had 2 clamps that were just the right length. this point, I'm probably going to do a little glue cleanup, but I'm going to let that set for a few hours, and then we'll be ready to move on to the next step. Got one final thing to do, kind of detail-wise, before we put the cleats in the seat platform, and that's to drill and do our pins at our joints. We do the sides and the front and back, lower rails, and then we do the top back rail as well. So what I've done is I just got a scrap piece of plywood that I've cut to the same width as my leg here. And I've got two sets of holes. One that's 1 inch from the edges of this rail, and then one that's 1.5 inches. And I'll drill the 1 inch holes on the front face, and then when I move my template to the side, I'll use the 1.5 inch holes. That way they don't necessarily overlap. It just kind of creates an interesting look too. So we've got this lined up. So we drilled 2 holes, and I've got some 1/4 inch white oak dowel, and I'm just going to kind of squeeze a little glue into that hole. We don't need a bunch. And then I'm going to drive in that pin, and this is a flush cut saw. And then we'll do the same for the lower hole here. It's probably not necessary that these are on this bench. And these mortise and tenon joints are plenty strong, and that glue joint's a pretty big glue joint. This just kind of adds a little extra strength and a little decorative touch as well. So I like to use a low angle block plane. Sanding block would work just as good, as I'd suppose. It's just to clean off the flush cut saw. It's not quite as flush as it used to be. We just trim those smooth. Work our way around the base and then do the top back rail, and we'll have this complete. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed the build of the Stick Leap Settee. The plans will be in issue 272 if you're a subscriber. If not, you can go online to woodmagazine.com to find these plans and many more. So thanks for joining us. Be safe.